As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
Protect the First Amendment. Impeach Joe Biden. Protecting democracy and the Constitution from Donald Trump and the MAGA extremists is a major theme of President Biden's re-election campaign. As is often the case in American politics, President Biden is just as, if not more, guilty of posing an existential threat to the Constitution as those he smears as extremists. For example, President Biden and members of his administration have waged a campaign to undermine the First Amendment by encouraging companies to suppress the expression of unapproved views online. The latest example of the administration trying to get a private internet company to censor Americans may be the most outrageous of all. House Judiciary Committee Chairman Jim Jordan recently released a series of emails between Biden administration officials and Amazon, the world's largest online retailer. The government officials wanted Amazon to remove from its online catalog books containing misinformation regarding the safety and effectiveness of COVID vaccines, meaning anything questioning the government's pro-vaccine propaganda. While Amazon did try to push back some against the administration, it did remove at least one anti-vaccine book from its online category. Amazon also manipulated its search results to make sure books expressing skepticism of the vaccines were buried under books touting the pro-vaccine line. The company probably hoped that by burying these dissident books, Amazon could make the administration happy without actually removing all books that question the COVID vaccines. The company also promised the administration that it would expand use of a Centers for Disease Control warning for books promoting anti-vaccine narratives. Some libertarians say that Amazon should not be criticized for its decisions. These libertarians point out that as a private company, Amazon has the right to decide what books to sell and also has the right to decide to make it difficult to find books expressing viewpoints the company finds dangerous or distasteful. This is true, but ignores one important fact. Amazon's decision to suppress books critical of COVID vaccines was not done to attract consumers who would not shop at a site that sells anti-vaccine propaganda or conspiracy theories. Instead, Amazon acted at the behest of government officials who were seeking to prohibit Americans from accessing alternative views. Amazon may have been eager to cooperate with the government to avoid being subjected to antitrust litigation. At the very time the administration was demanding Amazon suppress COVID dissidents, President Biden was preparing to appoint Lina Khan, an advocate for antitrust legislation against Amazon, to lead the Federal Trade Commission. It is clear that the U.S. government has been a major spreader of COVID disinformation, while those challenging the government's pro-mask, pro-vax, and pro-lockdown propaganda have been the main truth tellers. COVID is an example of why protecting the First Amendment is vital to protecting not just liberty, but also our prosperity and health. Congress should prioritize its investigation into the Biden administration's efforts to silence Americans because of their views. Congress should then impeach all high-level federal officials, including President Biden, who took action to violate Americans' First Amendment rights. Thanks for listening.
So Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Monday boasted that he had worked for decades to block the establishment of a Palestinian state. Netanyahu said, quote, "Everyone knows that I am the one who, for decades, blocked the establishment of a Palestinian state that would endanger our existence," end quote. And so this is something we've heard commonly from Netanyahu now recently. And, you know, it's always a big talking point that it's all the Palestinians' fault that there was never a two-state solution. But here you have Netanyahu now constantly saying that he worked to prevent a Palestinian state and that he's going to continue to do so. And he made these comments while discussing a plan to introduce legislation into the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, that would match a declaration made by the Israeli cabinet on Sunday that rejected international diktats related to a Palestinian state. So I covered that yesterday. That was approved unanimously by the Israeli cabinet. And these statements came after reports that said the U.S. and some of its Arab partners were looking to unveil an outline for a long-term peace deal that would include a firm timeline toward a Palestinian state. Netanyahu said that Israel is facing, quote, an attempt to force upon us the unilateral establishment of a Palestinian state, which will endanger the existence of the state of Israel, end quote. He said the Knesset legislation will, quote, show the world that there is wide agreement in Israel against the international efforts to force on us a Palestinian state, end quote. So a visit from an Iranian general to the Shia militias in Iraq led to a pause in attacks on U.S. forces. And this was reported by Reuters on Sunday. And the report cited Iranian and Iraqi sources. And we saw other reports and indications that Iran was telling them to stop. And this was on January 29th, which was one day after 3 U.S. troops were killed at Tower 22 at that base in Jordan on the Syrian border. Brigadier General Esmail Khani made the trip, and he is the commander of the Iranian Quds Force of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And so he warned that the death of the American soldiers would likely provoke a heavy American response and said the groups should lie low to avoid being targeted. A day after the visit, if you remember, Kateb Hezbollah, one of the most powerful Shia militias in Iraq, announced that it was suspending attacks on U.S. troops. In its statement, Kateb Hezbollah said that Iran, quote, repeatedly declared opposition to our escalation against the U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria, end quote. Initially, one faction did not agree to the Iranian request, and there were a few more attacks on U.S. bases, but there have been none since February 4th, which was the day 6 U.S.-backed Kurdish fighters were killed in a drone attack on a U.S. facility in Syria. So there's been none since February 4th. So that is significant because the attacks were happening just about every day since October. So there's been a calm. And I think besides the visit from the Iranian general, the Iranian pressure, the Iraqi government also seems to be stepping up its efforts to get the U.S. to withdraw, making a very public, their desire, and they did restart talks. So that might have something to do with this because that's a big goal of Kateb Hezbollah and the other Shia militias, which are part of the Popular Mobilization Forces, the PMF, which is part of the Iraqi security forces. They're part of Iraq's military. This is part of the reason why the Iraqi government was so angry about these U.S. airstrikes that they kept launching. So at least this one area has calmed down because this is definitely there's still a risk. There's still a major, just the U.S. presence in Iraq, the occupation of Syria. It's just such a big tripwire for a bigger war. The hearing for Julian Assange, his appeal hearing to fight his extradition to the U.S. begins today, and it will be held on Wednesday as well. And this is likely his final chance to appeal the UK decision to extradite him to the U.S., where he will stand trial for exposing U.S. war crimes. And all he did was publish documents that he obtained from a source. That's what journalists do, very standard practice. So if he's extradited and convicted, very grave implications for the First Amendment. It essentially would mean that the government could convict anybody using the Espionage Act that they want who's putting out information that they don't like. That's what it can mean. So Stella Assange, who is Julian Assange's wife, has been warning that, due to his weak mental and physical state, just the ordeal of this case, that she fears he will die if he's extradited to the U.S. And Assange's lawyer is saying the same thing. So Stella Assange told BBC that the stress from the case has left her husband in a very difficult place. She said, quote, this case will determine if he lives or dies, essentially, end quote. So Julian Assange's lawyer, Jennifer Robinson, has also warned that he could die if extradited due to his mental condition after being held in London's Belmarsh prison for over 4 years and the 7 years that he spent under asylum at the Ecuadorian embassy. She said, quote, because of the treatment he has suffered, he suffers a major depressive illness. He has been diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum, and the medical evidence is if he was extradited to the U.S., those conditions would cause him to commit suicide. So his life is at risk, and I am not exaggerating that, end quote. And the initial decision by the UK court was that he shouldn't be extradited to the U.S. because of the conditions of U.S. prisons are too harsh, and so the implication of that was that he could die, he might commit suicide or something in American prisons. The U.S. appealed that decision, and then they ruled to extradite him, and now this is Assange's appeal. So this is a really big deal. It's really important, this case, and there's been more pressure from the Australian government, from the Prime Minister, and the one thing that WikiLeaks and Assange supporters want Americans to do, just to put pressure on Congress right now to oppose the extradition, is there is a bill in the House that was introduced by Representative Paul Gosar, who's a Republican from Arizona, and basically it's just a bill that says the U.S. should drop the charges, regular journalistic activities are protected under the First Amendment. The United States should drop all charges against Julian Assange. So you could call your House representative and tell them to support this bill, say that it's important for First Amendment and press freedom in this country.
You're listening to Part of the Problem on the Gas Digital Network.
Well, I like that the New York City court system decided, hey, you can't make banks money. We have to bail them out. If they're looking at the economics, the way that banks are supposed to work, and you're not allowed to make the money. And then I listened to the prosecutor. She made a speech afterwards, and she said, this is not a victimless crime because it takes resources from other people. And I would love to hear the economics on how making money for a bank somehow takes away resources from other people. What individual walked into Deutsche Bank and didn't get a loan on behalf of them making a loan to Donald Trump that was making them money? Can you possibly explain to me who this individual is? Firstly, you don't have access to the same capital that Donald Trump is. You're not seeing the same loan officers. But the fact that you could pass a $400 million judgment off the basis that this somehow creates harm for people and that it removes resources from them. Can you explain that theory to me? Where's the economist behind that one? Just explain it.
Yeah, and Donald Trump's whole defense in this was that there were no victims. And typically, in a civil case, you can't just say, well, no, there are other theoretic victims who aren't involved in this case.
It's a little bit worse.
You have to actually point to the victims. So just to be clear, so everybody understands, this was not an instance in like a civil case. I think what most people think of is like some Judge Judy shit or something like that. Or obviously that's a lower level of it, but where it's when you watch Judge Judy, she's never deciding whether someone's going to jail or not. She's deciding who owes the other one $300. But now people also think of higher level civil cases where okay, they couldn't get OJ on the criminal case, but they could sue him civilly and then get him that way. But with all of these cases, you in your mind already, you have a victim who's suing somebody for doing something to them. But in this case, no victim is presented, but the government is coming in and saying, no, there is a victim here. And who is the victim? I don't know. They can't point to them, but they could theoretically say that, again, they're not claiming that he lost the bank money. They're claiming that if he valued his properties more accurately, he would have made them more money. And because he didn't make them more money, therefore they didn't have more money that they could have given out to a hypothetical victim. It just, the whole thing makes absolutely no sense. It's like everything with these legal charges, these ridiculous novel theories. And what's so funny about it is you're the guy was president of the United States of America. He backed the Saudis in a war of genocide. You could charge him for that. There's crimes here, but of course they won't do that because that would implicate all of the presidents, including Barack Obama and Joe Biden, who also backed the Saudis in a war of genocide. And Joe Biden is now backing Israel in a war of debatably genocide, I guess. But they can't charge him for any of that. So they're just coming up with this bullshit. And it's just so obvious. It's so obvious that this is only being done because there is such intense hatred for this guy. And there's a plan to not allow him a fair shot at running.
There's another element to this, which at least I think is funny, is that every time Donald Trump gave a document to the bank, it basically says on the bottom, and for all intended purposes, these documents are complete horseshit and you have to go do your own research. And guess what? Banks have all the resources in the world to research and decide whether or not they want to process your loan. That's the business that they're in. And if they choose to process your loan and they bet right and made money, how do you possibly insert yourself into that and go, what you did here? And by the way, the fraud's not even by him. It would be by whoever prepared the documents for him. Somebody actually prepares the documents, and the documents literally say on the bottom, hey, trust none of this, do your own homework. And the banks, they did their own homework and made money.
The other thing about it that's just hard to not recognize is just that, look, this is nothing new that we haven't said before, but there is our country is changing at such a rapid rate that it's kind of hard to keep up with. It's much easier when you kind of zoom out. It's much easier to look at, 30 years ago or something like that, and to go wow, we live in a drastically different country than we did in the 1990s, but just over the last 4 years, our country has changed very dramatically. And it does seem like this is a precedent for something different. And I'm certainly not someone who is saying America was perfect and we didn't have our problems before this. But this is something where if you are kind of hated, and this is more true than ever where we're so polarized, and particularly on political tribal grounds. And now it seems like the standard is almost if you are hated politically, the justice system can be weaponized against you and you will not be able to get a fair trial. You know, that was the kind of the truth with that kid who's looking at jail time for that tweet that he sent about texting a vote to Hillary Clinton. And this is just man, is it not a good sign? But imagine, you know, just like try to, you know, we talk about this all the time, but you're like, you got to really try to think about what we're talking about here. The former president of the United States of America, who's also the front runner to be the next president of the United States of America, is not being taken out by some negative ad campaign. You know what I mean? Like, he's not being taken out by, like, you know, big donors funding his opponent. He's being taken out by this obvious, I mean, what is so obvious, this mass attempt at every level to charge him with anything that you can twist yourself into pretzels to throw at the wall and charge him with. And then try him in these areas with biased district attorneys, biased judges, and biased juries.
And well, the fun part of it is they get to create their own evidence of now they get to run their campaign ads of the criminal who's been barred from doing business in New York State, or maybe it's just New York City, involved in 5 criminal court cases.
This guy and his group, they go back to SNCC in the 60s, and he founded this group in the early 70s, and they've been internationalists, black communists, of, you know, exactly how you categorize them, this whole time, longer than I've been alive. And man, I got a lot of white hair in my beard here. So the idea that, and so what, they ran for an election. They go, oh, you're interfering in the election on behalf of Russia. And now when you complain about being black in America and thinking that you're being treated unfairly, now you're sowing discord on behalf of Russia. Now, I got to tell you, I mean, as a line of crap, that's fine on MSNBC, and I'm sure all the white liberal women who watch that believe it. But they're going to try to make that stick in court against a guy?
Right.
That the same speech he's been given for 50 years is now sowing discord on behalf of a foreign power because he got $7,000 from a Russian national who, it's not even in evidence, is a spy of any kind. If they say he's tied to the Kremlin, that means they're not saying he's tied to the FSB. He's not tied to the GRU. Oh, he knows a political officer up there somewhere or something, and that's what they're going to hang on this guy? Is it as nuts as I think? Because I'm no lawyer. I don't know. But that's what it sounds like you're telling me here.
It is that nuts. And I mean, the fact is, if we lose this motion, I don't see how they could possibly prove this case, because you're raising a lot of very, very good points. But it's a legal matter. To get a case dismissed at this stage, to get an indictment dismissed, you basically have to argue that the allegations are false. These guys are not Russian agents. It's absurd. They can't prove that at trial. But if it were true, it still would violate the Constitution to go forward with this prosecution. So for a motion to dismiss, you have to assuming that the allegations in the complaint are true, it still is an unconstitutional prosecution and a dangerous prosecution. So yes, it clearly is an absurdity of Russiagate to try to get people to believe that these people are acting on behalf of Russia. And when you say sowing discord, that's right in the indictment. I think they use the word dissidents or something. But that's what activists do, right? I mean, Vietnam War activists were sowing discord in the United States. You make people think about their government and question their leaders and question, why are we in Vietnam? What is it? Are we being told the truth about the progress of the war? Are we being told the truth about why we're there? Are we being told the truth about the reasons we went there? And, that's sowing discord. If you
trip out and think about it, that's a pretty broad term, isn't it? Discord.
It sure is.
Yes. Who says there's anything negative about that at all, in fact?
I mean, if you're a good activist, isn't that your goal, to get people to think and question? I mean, if you're not causing some sort of discord, then you're probably not doing your job as an activist.
Yeah, seriously. Well, and especially if you're a black internationalist, revolutionary communist type, then it would seem like that's kind of part of the program.
Right.
And that's been legal for a long time. Just look at the Biden White House. They got it going on. Okay, that was a joke. It wasn't that funny. But they are kind of commie. But,
And just to correct one thing.
Sure.
These people I don't think they don't identify as communists. They're socialists.
Okay.
So
thank you for that correction. I should just call them what they call themselves. It's fine, because Red Star or whatever, and they're, they have their position, and it's people can hear them explain it in their own words, not mine.
You don't have to agree with them. You don't have to disagree with them.
Yeah.
It's about pure free speech, because you take away their.
I mean, it's almost even more to the point if they were like outright anti-American, revolutionary, commie, whatever, because even more to the point, we still got to protect them, right? Like, even if they're Nazis, even if they're,
That's true. That's
whatever
true. Even
insane
if
politics they might have, if their rights aren't protected, then none of ours are. And of course, like you're talking about, the dissident case on Ukraine is the truth. The government is wrong and is doing the wrong thing based on a bunch of lies. Everybody knows that. So
I think
that's kind of important for the story too, isn't it? That Mearsheimer and Sachs that you quote, they're right.
Right. And I think people are starting to, I think the tide is turning, and I think people are starting to realize that they've been misled, since 2022. I mean, it's kind of shocking. You look at the New York Times, and they don't even, when they talk about the Ukraine war, it's an unprovoked invasion in February of 2022. They don't even talk about the background. No, they don't try to educate their readers about the context of this war. And that's what these guys are doing. And I think the reason why, you're right. I mean, you can, under the First Amendment, advocate in theory, the overthrow of the U.S., I suppose. But that is sort of a fine line, because that's how they got around some of the only bad Supreme Court cases that on free speech use sort of the communist threat. And they talk about hearings in Congress and findings in Congress that the Communist Party has at its core the violent overthrow of the United States. And that's sort of how they got around how some of the bad rulings came out, saying that if you are a communist or if you're supporting the communist ideology, that could create a national security threat. So even if we go there, these guys don't do that. There's no question. They're not advocating for the overthrow of the United States government. They're not advocating for violence. Their rallies are peaceful. So this is really a very stark, I think that's why it's going to be very difficult for the district court judge to sign off on this, to say that, yeah, these people are so dangerous in basically having a political opinion about a war that's different from what the Biden administration opinion is. So I think that's what gives me hope that this case won't proceed to trial. And, the Supreme Court has also been clear that just letting this case stand, having it pending, is quite dangerous for free speech. There's cases, I think the Dombrowski case basically makes this point very well, that says just having the case pending is a message to other activists that you better watch what you say, because your home could be raided and you could be on trial in federal court and have to hire lawyers. And I think that's why this motion to dismiss is so important. Even though I'm confident that we're going to beat this case if it goes to trial in front of a jury, I still think it sets a really dangerous precedent to let it go forward.
Yeah.
Of course, we sure wish you could help our friend Assange a little bit more than so far anybody has been able to do. Yeah. There's been a lot of people hoping and praying and working for him. But what a tragedy. But there's some more hearings going on, and some claim this is it for him. He's on a ship to a dungeon in America someplace.
God hope not.
I doubt if they'll give him a hotel room.
No.
The hotel rooms are full anyway. The illegals are in here. So, but anyway, I think most people on our station have heard us talk about Assange, and this has been a tragedy going on 10 years or so. And he keeps getting, with the officials into a deeper hole. And it is said that this week there are some hearings going on again, maybe, and some claim it could be the final hearings before he gets sent to, the United States. And of course, there's a new thing that turned up this weekend that caught our attention. It tells you and indicates the typical type of people who are doing this. Well, maybe we have a good judge.
Yeah.
If we have a good judge, what the heck? A judge can do a lot to restore the principles of freedom and following the rules. But here it says Assange judge worked for MI6 and the Defense Administration. And this is the British, I assume, because that's where they've held him. So the Brits aren't, I sort of look at them as a minor state. That they just go along with whatever we tell them to do, and they do a lot, but they still have a lot of influence. So this is going to be a big deal.
U.S. Justice Department must drop spy charges against Julian Assange. And today and tomorrow are those hearings, and as you point out, the judge in these hearings, the sub-judge, does have some ties to what we would call the global deep state. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean he's not capable of making an objective choice, but it is somewhat worrisome. Our good friend Thomas Massey and Representative Jim McGovern put out a letter to their colleagues. If you can put this next one up, very good letter. It had a lot of bipartisan support. Apologies for this being pretty small, but it's just urging President Biden to drop the charges against Assange. It makes the point that across the world, mainstream media, alternative media, members of the House of Representatives have all urged the end of the persecution of Assange because what he's doing is journalism. And you go to the next page, you can see that it's a very bipartisan. This is only some of the names that have signed it, but I think Senator Paul is on it. But when you have Thomas Massey, Paul Gosar, and Ilhan Omar, and Ilana Pressey, and Marjorie Taylor Greene, you know it's a pretty good group of people across the board who are trying to get Assange, get the charges dropped. The idea that, I mean, what Assange, as we've said so many times, Dr. Paul, he simply published information that someone leaked him, which is no different than what the New York Times does, Washington Post with the Pentagon Papers. You know, they do this all the time and they've never been. But they also realize that there's a threat that if Assange can be put in prison for 175 years for publishing leaked classified documents, then they can hear the footsteps coming for them. And I think that's why. It's not that the New York Times has suddenly, gotten religion, but they realize that this could come for them. So it really is a dangerous situation for Assange.
Yeah.
Look at this, if we can put it on there. The outrageous part of the UK's years-long trial to condemn Julian Assange to die in an American dungeon is that the victim of his quote-unquote crime, i.e. journalism, is a state rather than a person. It's a definition of a political offense which the US-UK extradition treaty explicitly forbids. And that is a great point.
Boy.
The victim, quote unquote, is the state, not an individual. So that means by definition, this is a political crime. They can't extradite for a political crime.
Unless they get away with it.
Yeah, unless they get away with it.
So that's what we don't want them to do, because other than that, there will be no rule of law, and that's on the table right now for what's going to happen in the future. Because you think about the elections that have gone on, a lot of controversy, a lot of evidence, and yet it was said that Trump was evil. Trump did everything, and it turned out that the opposition was doing what they accused him of.
Yeah.
So it's bad news, but I still believe in documentation.
Yeah.
And I think the most important thing is that people retain their credibility, because the good people like Snowden.
Yeah.
Snowden, look at what he's been through.
Yeah.
He could have been thrown in a dungeon and forgotten about it, but fortunately he was able to maneuver. So so he's I bet he's one of the most listened to journalists right now ever.
And he can't even come back to his own country.
Yeah,
though,
that's what he had to give up.
Can't come home. Well, one more I just wanted to put up. I know we need to move on to our other topic, but this is a really good point, I think, and this is put out by Declassified UK. Now, the article said CIA officials under Trump discussed assassinating Julian Assange, and that's a news article. Classified UK commented on this, saying, "This week, the UK High Court will decide whether to extradite Julian Assange to a country which spied on his privileged legal conversations and plotted to kidnap or kill him. The independence of the UK judiciary is on trial." And that's pretty interesting. We remember, but Pompeo was trying to plot to kill Assange, and now the UK is going to send him to the country that plotted to kill a guy from doing journalism.
I'd like to have somebody do a poll as objectively as possible and ask people, not only the ones that listen to our program, but be as objective as they can possibly be, and say, can you trust the CIA if you'd happen to run a mess, run a mess with him and run into them? And I don't think there'd be an overwhelming number of Americans that say, "Oh, I trust them. I trust them." Right now, the FBI in the last year or two, there was finally some more exposure by the FBI. But we were always taught for so long, and I came of age when I was in college, that the FBI was to be respected. And there were some conservatives that were in the FBI that I knew personally, and there was an assumption that I liked them and I trusted them. But I don't think that exists. And then if you got a little bit of history of J. Edgar Hoover, maybe you would wake up and say, maybe it didn't even start off well.
Yeah.